Thursday, and we're going to talk about crime. We're going to talk about maybe some options for victims. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was something I read that was given to me actually by one of my volunteers who works with us in not the BBC, but the BBB, which is the Better Business Bureau. Put out their list of the 10 riskiest scams of 2018, and a lot of these are going to sound familiar, but it gives some good information in there, so I wanted to kind of hit on it. One of them, which is their number one, I guess, was the employment scams, and that was the riskiest of all in 2018. So here's what they say. If you're applying for a job, make sure to use the company's official website. Don't click on any supposed job links in emails or social media posts. Employment scams are often used as a cover for check fake scams. And one of the things that I noticed about this, and I had gotten it from the on something I was going to buy one time, and a guy sent me an official U.S. Post Office money order, and all he did was scan the logo and such on there. But what he said was that once the items were received on his end, the money order would automatically kick in, which made no sense at all. So I really didn't think it through. But a lot of that stuff involves employment scams, and they may go into this in a short time, but there are people that they'll go on a job site or a recruiting site, and they're looking for a particular job, and they'll be contacted by somebody, and that person will tell them, we're going to send you a check for office supplies, computer supplies, and so forth. And they send the person, for instance, $2,500, and the person only needed to buy $1,000 worth of stuff. And they said, we've sent you too much money, here's what you do. After you buy the supplies, write us a check for the balance and send it on to this address. And so they buy the stuff, and by the time they've bought it, hopefully the bank hasn't informed them yet that that check is no good that they sent them. We got slammed with that about 4 or 5 years ago, so I think it slacked off a little bit. But they were sending the money to a third party, and at times the third party wasn't even in the country. So they were sending this money and then finding out 4 or 5 days later that that check was no good. That was very common for a while. But anyway, and it says here they'll hire you, give you your first paycheck. You're supposed to deposit that. Part of the money goes for other purpose, such as buying equipment or paying a fee. What happens is the check bounces. Another one is online purchases. This person said it's easy to fake a website, make it look like a legitimate company, which is true. It's not hard.
Steve, you mentioned that you all are slammed, and this would be Sandy Springs, I assume. But where does the line draw between that would seem like mail order fraud of some sort? Where does it draw between
that might be a good
local
question.
and federal?
Yeah, but and there is it does cross over, especially if it crosses over states. It becomes federal jurisdiction as well. Just like all scams, they're very hard to track, although now I think the resources that the federal investigators use are even better. When I was active with it, this is a few years back, so now the technology's evolved quite a bit. So who knows? That might be a good question for the guest here at 1:30 who did that for a while. But an online purchase, you may be purchasing a cheap knockoff of something with a fake label on it. And one thing they say, it's true in everything. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. If you don't, you're not going to get something for nothing. And just do your research. Fake checks, money orders. If you're selling a car, couch, or another item on Craigslist, and this comes up all the time where they'll give you a fake check or a fake money order, you hang on to the item until the check clears.
Let me ask another question, because I just got this the other day in an email. Your order has shipped.
Mm-hmm.
Ain't mine, brother. And I sent them a nice little thank you note. It wasn't exactly the TU note, it was a different one.
Yeah.
But has that become?
Your order is shipped and you don't know what they're talking about?
Yeah, and here enclosed is your invoice, and
It might be that someone could have copied the payment information and used your information to make that payment. And a lot of times they're trying to intercept the package when it gets there. So who knows? I mean, they do that when they steal mail. They'll sign, or they'll fill out a credit card application in your name and then wait for the card to be mailed, and they literally drive by the mailbox every morning trying to get it. But I've sold a lot of things on Craigslist, and we always say Craigslist is the haven for scams, in which in a sense it can be. I've made several purchases, and I've sold several things. I sold a boat on Craigslist to a guy one time. But unless it's a tremendous amount of money, I always want to deal in cash, and that eliminates that. If you get a check from somebody, just make sure at the very beginning that I'll relinquish the item once the check is cleared. And you don't want to take a check, sell the item, and then the check comes back fake, because that's how all this happens. They're hoping that you'll just make the swap, the check goes in the bank, 3 days later you get a call from the bank saying the check's no good.
Okay, can you still call the bank and say, I'm holding a check on Joe Smith?
Yeah.
Is it good?
Yeah. You could take it to that bank if you wanted to and let that bank cash it, or let that bank verify that it's a good check. I mean, it's almost to the point where you're trying to buy something, or you're trying to sell something, you're almost to the point of being rude, saying, I don't trust anybody, we're going to go through this process, and people get offended and say, but if that's the case, don't sell them something. Somebody else will come along and buy it. Another thing that they talked about, a home improvement, and that goes back years and years and years, and really nowadays, if you need something done to your house, do the research, find out who does that kind of work, find out their rating. Even if you go on and you look at reviews online, those things can be tweaked too, because companies will have maybe pay for favorable reviews, and then disgruntled people will get on there and hammer them. So you can't put 100% in that. But if you do your research on a company, or you get a word-of-mouth referral from somebody who had the work done, that's the best way to do it. But there are people working, for instance, a guy said he working on a project nearby and construction nearby, and he had leftover materials from the job, and he'll build something for you, or he'll do something for you. He takes a payment up front, and you don't see him again, because those materials have been paid for by the previous person, or else he just stole them. But you remember I spoke about being politely skeptical. Is just always think, what's the worst case scenario in this situation? And somebody wanting to come by and just out of nowhere going to give you a great deal on a construction price. Here's the material, and you pay them up front. You never pay up front. I mean, you never should pay up front anyway, but people do. Here's another one, advanced fee loans. With an advanced fee loan, a lender approves your loan and then asks you to pay a fee before you receive the money. Okay, that's illegal. Anytime somebody wants to take money from you before they give you the money, that's a pretty big flag that you're dealing with a scam. Romance scam. This has not happened to me. Has it happened to you?
Oh yeah, as a matter of fact, it has. I was contacted by, and this is where the false pictures come in too. Someone saying that they were in their 60s and sending a picture of someone in their 20s at best, and then it came up with, well, my mother's sick, but I'd like to fly to wherever you are,
Yeah.
Send me, yeah. And I said, I don't know, maybe I'm doing something illegal, but I do have a badge. It's a carry badge, but it's a badge, okay? And so I'll come back and say, look, come on down and I want to show you my badge. Have I done anything illegal? I'm not saying I'm a cop. I just said I'll show you my badge, and it's
No, not really. That wouldn't be impersonating. I've seen the concealed carry badge. Is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
yeah.
When did they start doing that?
You can buy them anytime you want to.
Anyway, I'm just not familiar with them, but
You
I
know,
know what you're talking about. No, not really. If you said I was a police officer, yeah, you're impersonating. You can cross the line pretty easily, but if you just generically say I have show you my badge, it could be a convention badge. Who knows? So yeah, I mean, but the ones I remember were people impersonating servicemen and or a veteran that had just recently been discharged, didn't have enough money to do something, and I mean they developed a relationship with a woman, and it went on through email, and then the woman began to send money for things, and it's sad because you're dealing with a very lonely person. It's the same reason that the case that I talked about, where the older man who in his either late 80s or early 90s was visited by a girl that was, she's probably 25 years old. He ended up giving her $40,000, and he said at one point he knew he was being scammed. So, I mean, it's too bad for take pick. There's no dignity in a person. There's no honor in a person when they pick on little children and they pick on seniors. Now, you and I are not the youngest in the world, but at least we still have some degree of me especially, because I'm skeptical of anything. But you just the too good to be true theory, it just sits in my mind every time somebody is trying to either sell me something. It's like, and I almost feel sorry for the guys that, when you go to buy a car, because that salesman's automatically the enemy, and you're just trying to shoot down everything he can possibly offer and hoping to get a deal.
I thought I was fairly knowledgeable or fairly astute until we started doing our other show, Safe, and Joe pointed out things, you pointed out things, and like you hit it on the head, though. If it's too good to be true, or this thing of the IRS scam where they'll call up and like I said, I'll give you my badge number if you'll give me yours. Click, and they're gone. But
it's unfortunate, but you have to be that way.
Yeah.
It's like when the police car pulls the car over at night, and the woman wants to see the badge number and the name of the officer. We tell them, show them, and in some cases, they wanted to see the ID card even though he's in uniform. I mean, just let them see it. That's what it's for. I mean, in detectives, you did that all the time. You were in regular clothing, and they would want to see the badge and the ID card, and that's that's good. That's something that you should do.
We need to take a break.
Okay, we'll see you in a few.
Whether cruising the strip in a '57 Chevy or taking the family on a vacation in a '71 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser, you need to tune in to Classic Cars with Steve Ronaldo and Jim Weber every Saturday from 8 to 9 a.m. on americaswebradio.com.
Quick Stakes, that's Q-U-I-K Stakes, are not just for surveyors. They are great for family and community gardens. Go online to www.quickstake.com or contact your local land surveying supply dealer and get you a box of Quick Stakes. You'll love them every year when you plant your garden. Again, that's Quick Stakes, Q-U-I-K Stakes, the truly preferred way to stake and identify what's in your garden now.
Get your pen and paper ready. If there's a move in your near future, I'm here to tell you that the folks I used and now recommend is Around Town Movers. Timothy and the guys recently moved me, and I am and was totally satisfied with a sometimes not so fun experience moving. Call Timothy at 770-378-4708 and make it a good move and a good experience. Around Town Movers for that local or cross-country move. Timothy, Around Town Movers, in my opinion, are the best. That's Around Town Movers. Call them.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Hi, everybody. This is Steve Rose again, and we were sitting here talking about scams, which is a never-ending subject, but I was going over the Better Business Bureau 2018 top 10 list, and we talked about advance fee loans, and we talked about romance scams, and another one that comes up is the tech support scams, and these are fairly common. Somebody represents a major company such as Google, Apple, or Microsoft. Through your email, pops up, says something's wrong with your computer, and at that point, if you take the bait and click on the link, somebody on the other end is going to try to either access your password and get into your computer, or try to get personal information from you. So even if they're going another route with trying to get you to pay for viruses and such that they say you have on your computer, then you're still giving them too much information. And if you pay them, you could be doing it through a card, and the card will be compromised. So we have somebody on the line.
We do.
And we talking to the famous Tony Rose yet?
Yeah, you should be. Tony, can you hear us?
I can hear you barely, but I can't hear Steve.
It may be a good thing. How about now?
That's, can you hear us now, or is it still low on your end?
Yeah, I can hear you very low, but I can't hear Steve, which usually is a good thing. But
No. Okay, let's try it again.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear?
I bet you can now.
All right, Tony, on the line?
Oh, yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. So anyway, we were talking about, I had looked over the Better Business Bureau 10 riskiest scams of 2018, and one of them that we were talking about, David and I were talking about, had to do with fake checks and fake money orders, and his question was, is there federal jurisdiction if it's done through the mail? And I said that'd be a good question for you. So you're familiar with you've fake checks that are being sent to buy stuff, or stolen checks, money orders that are being fabricated in order to buy stuff from somebody on Craigslist or something. Did you guys get involved in a lot of that stuff?
Yeah, we did. Anything that you send through the mail fraud statute is any scheme that uses the U.S. mail, or actually says interstate carrier, so technically FedEx and UPS qualify, but we did get involved in that. The crooks got really good at counterfeiting checks, and they do cashier's checks for $20,000 or something like that. Or if you posted something on Craigslist and you're selling a car for $3,000, they'd send you a check for $7,000 and say, well, you keep the $3,000 and wire the rest of it back to us.
Right.
And then 10 days later you find out it's a fake check and your bank wants the money.
Yeah.
But we did get involved in them because they did use the mail.
We got involved in them too because they were employment scams, and so they would send them money for office supplies and send the balance over to another address. And I mean, I remember one specific address was in Nigeria, and I said that was a screaming clue. But so we, tech support scams are probably very popular. I was just talking about that when more stuff pops up on our email, and and you either give them access to your computer or you're giving them a card number or something. And one of them I haven't really seen too much, but they always talk about are investment scams, and they're usually counterfeiting the logo of a well-known investment company and trying to get you to make an initial investment into a company that doesn't exist. And the other two that I was going to talk about, travel and vacation scams, too good to be true. It usually is. That pretty well sums it up. Paying advance fees for something is generally a recipe for disaster. Government grant scams, that's another one, because there are all sorts of grants that are out there that are legitimate, but in the middle and like weeds growing up through the garden, there can be a lot of scams out there. But the one absolute of all these scams that are talked about, the things are the fact that if you do your research and you just be skeptical until they prove you wrong, I think you'd be okay. So that concludes that. So Tony, I know we were going to talk about Jamaican investigations into Jamaican scams, and I'm not all that familiar with it. So can you kind of give me or kind of give us an overview of that?
Well, there were two different kinds of scams that we worked a lot of, and one of them was Jamaican lottery scams. The other ones were West African scams that have been around for years. But the Jamaican lottery ones got real big in the past several years, where these, and it's mostly older people, but not always, that were getting victimized. But it was, you just get a call out of the blue. These people would get a call and it'd say, "Hey, congratulations, you won the lottery scam," or the lottery scam. You won the lottery. That
being honest.
And you're going to get $5 million. You're going to get a Cadillac. You're going to get this and that. All we need to do to make things expedite a little faster is we need $5,000 for the taxes. Or we need $5,000 to pay the government to let us release the money, or whatever. And if you pay the $5,000, then they're going to come up with something else, and they're going to say, well, now we need another $8,000 for this or that or the other thing. And it's fees to the government, it's taxes, it's whatever they can come up with, and they just. As long as they can keep pulling money out of you, they're going to keep coming up with a reason why you need to pay a little bit more. And that $5 million is right around the corner. We're going to have a guy bring it to you. They're going to drive that Cadillac right up to your house.
Yeah.
And people just keep paying until they're literally a lot of them were just flat ran out of money.
Yeah.
They had nothing left, and so the family members a lot of times didn't find out until it was too late. And then they try to stop it, but these people would call them, and I would go to their house and I would talk to these victims, and while I'm sitting there with them, they're getting calls from the guy. And I remember one in particular, I'm sitting at the table, and we've told them this is a scam, and the guy said, yeah, I understand now. And the lottery guy calls up, and he says, I'm sitting here with the police right now, don't call me back, and he'd hang up. And 10 minutes later, they'd call and they go, "Is he still there?" And I'd go, "Yeah, we're still here." I'd get on the phone with them and say, "We're still here." And then you hang up, and 20 minutes later, they call, "Is he still there?" And they would wait till we leave, and they would call and they say, "That guy's fake. He's not real. He's just telling you that he's police, but he's not." And they're pretty good at it because they got a lot of people to send them a lot of money.
Yeah, but I think at some point they get greedy too, because it was like the old pigeon drop. We're going to all chip in earnest money, and we're going to split $3 million, and you get to hold the $3 million in this really security-safe briefcase that we're going to put in your closet. And at some point, the victim just realizes that, this is going to be so great. I'm going to have all this money. I'm just going to go ahead and pay this $5,000 up front. But I think at some point they get a little greedy, and it overrides their common sense, because the outcry always came from a son or a brother or sister, because the victims were generally 50 plus years old. But, I won the Spanish lottery twice, and this is going back to the mid-'90s when I was working investigation, and I got the letter addressed to the precinct. So they had pulled the address. I don't know how they got the address, but they sent it to the precinct, and it was addressed to me, and it was and the address up on it was funny. It was Spanish lottery, and they had an address that was supposedly in Spain, but it was mailed like someplace from Cleveland or someplace in the States. And even the logo was faded. It was in the early days of scanning. They probably used one of those old scanners where you just run it across the page, and but people still fall for this stuff because they just believe that they can get something for nothing.
Yeah, and it's just once they're on the hook and the person starts sending money, these scammers like to share information, and so all of a sudden they would get a call from somebody else going, well, now we have one in particular was they needed him to invest in a Colombian coffee field that they were building, and they needed investors, and so they start sharing it back and forth. But and then a lot of times these people don't have much money, and so when they've lost and they say I can't pay any more money, the scammers will go, well, I tell you what we're going to do is we're going to have people send you checks, and when you get the checks, you put them in an envelope and you mail them to us. And because the scammers realized that if they called people and said, send me a $5,000 check to this address in Jamaica or this address in Nigeria, people go, whoa, wait a minute, something's up. But if they're sending it to some guy in Florida, and then that guy in Florida gets all these checks from people, and his job is to package them up and ship them over to Nigeria or Jamaica or wherever, and then they'll tell him, if you do that, if you act as a middleman for us, then that'll work toward you paying off your debt to us for the fees and different things, and you'll still get that Cadillac and $5 million. So in that way, they got more money because people felt better about sending the money to some guy in Florida rather than overseas.
Yeah. So here's a question. How successful were you prosecuting these guys?
That got to be tough. The Nigerian government has never been really cooperative as far as going after people for us. It got better several years ago, but it's still tough. The first problem you have to do is you have to figure out who it is, and that's real tough to do. If they've got somebody here in the United States that's helping them, then we can go after them, and we did have some success in especially with West African groups where they had representatives in the United States. We could go after them. But if they were just wiring the money directly overseas, or if the little old lady in Florida was shipping money orders to Nigeria and you go talk to her and she doesn't have a clue who she's sending the money to. So those get a little bit tougher. And I had two Jamaicans in Jamaica that got about $1 million from a guy, and we never were able to even figure out who they were or put anything together because the paper trail just didn't lead anywhere. Mm-hmm. Once the money got wired to Jamaica, there was nothing to tie the money to them. Oh. So it is tough if they're just solely based overseas. They started running a lot of the scams out of Canada, and we had a lot of success with grabbing guys up there because the Canadian and United States, they have a task force now that's strictly for this. It's a cross-border. They have a long acronym, but it's basically a cross-border task force that, we could send information to Canada and say this is where the money was wired to at Western Union or wherever, and they would work it from that end, and they were able to grab a bunch of people up there. Yeah, like them. But if it's just strictly overseas, it's real tough. All we try to do is stop it, but getting prosecution is a whole nother matter if it's just solely based on overseas. Yeah. So David, do you have a question?
I was just going to help Tony out with Jamaica a little bit. You could find the ones that were getting $1 million in Jamaica because they have the new car that's actually a new car, and they also have indoor plumbing.
Yeah, and actually of course I retired a couple of years ago, so I'm not real sure how it's still going, but within probably the last 3 or 4 years, the Jamaican government got tired of all the heat they were catching for all these different scams, and they really shut down on it. They went after a bunch of their fraudsters. Actually, the postal inspectors, they have somebody posted in Jamaica and working with the government, and they were able to really crack down on it. If Western Union at the time, you couldn't wire any money to Jamaica because rather than sending checks, a lot of people, they would tell them go to Western Union and wire the money to whatever Western Union they told them to. And Jamaica was catching so much, and Western Union was catching a lot of grief over it, that they shut that part of it down. So it did get better, but it's it's a reactive thing. So by the time they start catching up with the crooks, they've already gotten a lot of the money.
Do those cases stay? I mean, you close them out. Oh, I'll get to that in just a minute. We're going to go to a break, so we'll be back in just a few.
The disease of addiction is a life-altering challenge, not just for the person suffering its effects, but also for the family and friends who support and
I don't know if it's my end or yours.
What should be the course of treatment?
Can you hear?
Who is the best
This
person?
is
Just barely. If I really press the thing up to my ear, I can.
Okay, I think it's because
We
we're in a
know that
commercial.
you want answers to these
We're in a
and many
commercial.
more.
What else you want to talk
I've
about?
got my volume all the way up, but
696.
so if I don't respond to you, it's because I didn't hear it.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
With,
But I mean it's real low.
Oh, okay. So, what do you want to hit on now? Got any war stories?
Well, I can tell you about my old guy that lost $5 million to the Jamaicans and the Nigerians and half the other world of fraud.
Yeah.
Poor old guy had dementia, and he was a executive with BP Oil and had a ton of money. And that's where those two Jamaicans, they got $1 million from him, but we were able to freeze the bank account where they didn't get much of it out. But
You're listening to
I don't know.
America's Web
Hang on.
Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Hi, we're back. This is Steve Rose, and I'm sitting here with David Moxley, and we're talking to Tony Rose out in Houston, retired postal inspector, and we talked last week about some scam and fraud, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to carry it over again this week. So, and we've been talking about Jamaican cases that he worked because a lot of fraud comes from overseas. And then during the break, we were talking about a case that he worked, so I wanted to kind of get into that. So, Tony, why don't you take us into that?
Well, one case in particular I worked, and it's kind of indicative of the general way these lottery and fraud scams work from overseas. Is there was a guy in Houston that was an executive for a big oil company, and he had a lot of money, but he also had early onset of dementia that the family had not figured out yet. He was still working at the time, and he started getting these lottery calls, and you just get a lottery call out of the blue that says, hey, you won this X amount of money, and you didn't enter any lottery, but they talk you into paying the fees and different things. And once they figure out that somebody's going to pay, they start sharing the information. So he started getting calls from all different people saying, we need you to invest in this. It's a 3-month investment. You're going to double your money. We need fees for that and other things. Well, this guy had a lot of money, so he started wiring money, and he was wiring money at $200,000 and $300,000 and $400,000 at a time, going to different places. He sent $1 million to Jamaica. He sent probably about $2.5 million over to Nigeria, Then he started wiring money to people in the United States, or he would send a check. And these people were what I was talking about earlier. They were part of the lottery. They were a lottery victim too. And instead of paying money, they agreed to be the middleman for the funds. So when he would wire money to one guy in New York, that guy turned around and wired the money to Nigeria or to London or wherever.
Did he take a cut?
We were able to find two people, one in Georgia and one in Texas, that were involved in it. He was actually walking into, at the time, and I don't know if they still do it, Wells Fargo Bank, and I believe it was Bank of America. You could walk into a bank in Houston and deposit money into somebody else's account, and then they could go in Atlanta, and they could, in Georgia, and they could withdraw the money in Georgia like 15 minutes later. So that's what he would do. He would walk into a bank here, he would deposit $50,000, and 30 minutes later, a guy in Atlanta, Georgia, was withdrawing the $50,000. So he was sending money right and left, and his family finally caught on to it when the dementia got real bad. And he sent a total of about $5 million to different people. We were able to freeze bank accounts and got about a third of it back. The Jamaican money we were able to freeze that where they couldn't get it. But most of the other ones, they'd pull it out of there as soon as he sent it. We did arrest a guy in Atlanta, and we arrested a guy here in Texas that were actually going into banks and withdrawing money. But the ones overseas, we had nothing to chase down who was receiving the money over there.
You talked about the middleman, though. The middleman, was they taking a cut of the money? It would be mailed to the middleman and then mailed on to the guy in Jamaica, and they were taking a cut off the top, or how'd that work?
Well, if they were a victim, they typically wouldn't get any money. They were just trying to work off their debt because they owe $10,000 in fees for their lottery. And so the crooks had told them was, here's how you can pay off your fees. So typically they wouldn't take a cut. The two guys that we arrested never would talk to us.
They still thought they were going to get the money as soon as they paid those fees.
Yeah, they were. Their thing was, they just ran out of money, and so when they run out of money, the crooks wanted to keep them on the hook, and they'd say, well, and they also needed a U.S. address to have stuff sent to them.
Yeah.
And they would just tell them, you receive the checks once a week, you go and you put it in a package, and they would, typically a lot of them would, and this is how we found out about it, they'd go to their local post office with a priority mail package, and some of the postal clerks were really good because we had gone around and told them what to look for, and they would ask what's in the package, and they'd find out, and they would actually refer it over to us to go visit these people, and we would shut it down that way. But it's like cockroaches; they just kill one, and there's 50 other ones. So,
I can't believe. I find it hard to believe that these people that are working off their debt, paying their fees in order to get that big payoff at the end. I mean, how dumb were these people? Because, you be the middleman for us to collect these fees. I mean, when does the light go on? Did any of them figure it out ahead of time and just decided they needed to go ahead and do it, or did they actually think they were going to get that money? Because it just screamed fraud.
They would still believe that there was some money going. Some of them said, well, it kind of sounded a little fishy, and then by the time we got there and told them, then they go, okay, now it's fishy. But we actually had some that said, I understand it's a scam now, and we would tell them stop, and we would have them sign a cease and desist to, get any packages or anything like that, and then we'd find out a month later they're still doing it. And actually, a couple of them we ended up going back and arresting them because now they're a part of it once they've been educated.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's amazing what people would believe thinking of that Cadillac. We would have to argue with people sometimes that you are not getting that Cadillac, no money's coming, and they would still argue with us and say, yeah, it is. It's on its way. This guy, he just texted me, and he said it's on its way.
Yeah.
So it's.
I mean, I've seen that at the local level where you really have to convince a victim that they're a victim.
Yeah.
And then the double-edged sword is you have to try to convince them to prosecute, because it's almost fashionable now to where okay, I had a burglary and I had some stuff stolen, and then we go and we find the property and we do find the perp, and people are reluctant to prosecute. And they go at the beginning, and I used to have to do the community meetings, and I would go to a meeting, and they would literally heckle me because, this guy that lived in this $2 million house down on Riverside Drive had gotten burglarized for the first time ever. I remember one guy just went off on me when we started the new city and said that he never had a problem with the old county police, and I said, that's because you never had any interaction with them. I said, nothing ever happened. It's just bad timing that you had a burglary here. I said, but and he said, well, the detectives never called us back and all this, and the detectives did. They did everything. This man literally threw a tantrum, and then he demanded that we will prosecute this guy. And then, a couple weeks later, the insurance is paying off that stuff that he had stolen, and this guy who was carrying the flag of justice now has just laid it down and said, well, I'm busy, life goes on, and they don't want to prosecute. And that was a big problem us for a while, but and then if you're talking about scams and your fraud, it's so confusing for people. They don't really understand what their role is in it. So you have to.
We would kind of have the same problem, except on the federal level, it would be I would have a trial coming up, and I've got all these people who are victims of identity theft or lottery scams or whatever, and we've got a guy going on trial, but I've got to produce these victims because the federal statute for identity theft, I actually have to. You don't have to, but it really helps to actually put the person on the stand that says, I'm Tom Jones, and this guy that was opened a bank account in my name and stole a bunch of money. That's not me. I'm me sitting right here.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got to convince a guy that lives in Wisconsin or California or whatever that, hey, we want to fly you down here for 2 days to Houston to sit around in a courthouse and wait to testify. And
they don't want
a lot of them were very nice, but they've got a life, and especially. I call them the week before the trial, and I go, well, now it's been reset, and it gets reset again, and now they've got conflicts, and
it's tough.
They were usually wanted them prosecuted, but they didn't want to be the one that had to fly to Houston and sit around and wait to testify. So it got to be that was the worst part of the trials, was actually getting people here.
Well, that's why I don't miss going to court, because you would, especially Superior Court, because you'd sit around. You know what I'm talking about. You'd sit around for 3 or 4 hours a day trying to wait on your case being called up. So we're going to go to another break, and we'll see you in a few.
Perhaps you are struggling to cope with the disease of addiction. If not, you probably know a family member or friend that needs help in battling the cravings and the personal and professional damage done by the effects of drugs or alcohol. Get a pen and paper and be ready to write down the following.
So what else? You got any ideas? We are at the last 15 minutes, David. Last 15 minutes.
They're doctors and counselors with over 40 years of practice in the field of addiction.
I don't know. It's your show.
You get stretch.
And experienced manner, and guide him or her along the path to recovery. So call 770-696-9862 and speak to a knowledgeable staff member about how you or your loved one can be helped to enjoy a better and healthier life. More information.
Yeah, I mean, interstate commerce.
www.atlantahealingcenter.com.
We did hit on that and talked about where jurisdiction comes
the
in.
Docs for Patient Care Foundation is your way to join
I'll
the
talk
fight
a little
and
bit
become
about
a member
local
of an
stuff.
organization created by doctors for patients,
All right.
dedicated to
Yes,
fighting for your
thank you
healthcare
as
freedom
always, so hang
and
in there.
preserving the doctor-patient relationship. Get a pen and paper. Write down www.docsforpatientcarefoundation.org. That's www.docsforpatientcarefoundation.org. Go to our site and please make a generous tax-deductible donation.
Did you play baseball this week?
Today. Thank you.
No, we got eliminated. The fall season starts at the end of July.
Okay.
So.
All right. Hey, we're back. This is Steve Rose. I'm sitting in the studio here with David Moxley, and we're talking to Tony Rose, who's sitting in Houston, Texas. And Tony is a retired postal inspector. And we've been talking about all sorts of scams, Jamaican scam, lottery scams, and all the different scams that pop up. But, locally, and, we were talking about Nigerian investigations back in the late 80s when I first was exposed to them, and it was just a total paper chase with 9 times out of 10 a dead end. I don't recall us ever making a successful case here because most of them ended up out of the country. I do know we found some folks that were doing the pigeon drops across the country, and we tracked them to Covington, Georgia, and then we were able to work with several jurisdictions to get them arrested. And they had spent every nickel that they had made. They had made well over $1 million on found money scams, and they had spent every nickel of it on, I assume, fast living. But, Tony was a county police officer before he went to the prestigious and glamorous life of federal investigations. But when you work cases, Tony, when you work in cases and you do interact with the local, I think you're in Harris County, which is Houston, but didn't you work a lot of cases where the local police were also involved?
Yeah, we did, and I kind of laugh when I watch TV shows where they have, like the FBI or some federal agency working with local cops, and the federal agency comes in and they're all high and mighty, and they bicker with the locals, and the locals hate them, and it was never that way with us. I can only remember a couple of times that there was some resentment from local guys, but most of the time, especially if we weren't sure at the time if the case was going to go federal or state, or even if we knew it was going to go federal and we still needed help from the locals, I mean, they were always nice, and I was nice to them, and I'm respectful because my caseload is probably 1/20th of what theirs is.
Yeah.
They've got 100 cases they're balancing at one time, and I've got 15 maybe. So they were way overworked. If I went to them and I said, hey, I know you're working this case, but it's part of my case at a bigger level, can I take this case from you? And they go, sure, here it is, and here's 5 more if you want them.
Yeah, I know.
So, I mean, we always had a good relationship with them. If we needed help, especially if we went to do, if we were going to go serve a search warrant or an arrest warrant at somebody's house, it was always nice to have a uniform car there. Just, when the crook looks out the window, he sees a police car and not just a bunch of us dressed up. So, but they were always willing to come help us with patrol units or, helicopters if we needed it. But it was never like on TV where you just have this attitude that, the feds are marching in and we're important and you're not. It was,
no.
They were always very helpful, and we were helpful to them when we could help them out. And I hardly ever ran across a bad situation.
Yeah, I agree with you. I worked when I did some executive work. I worked with Secret Service. Worked with them. I mean, it's kind of a stretch, but they would come in because they had dignitaries, or the DSS would come in when they had someone like, I remember the head of the Greek Orthodox Church came and did a visit, and they provided the security for that, and then they used part of ours. But I remember working with the Secret Service on a counterfeit case back when they used lithographs and before the computers got to where they were so good. And the guys that were working the counterfeit for Secret Service had done everything else, and this was kind of the last rodeo for these guys, and they were really good guys, and they had all the cool equipment. They had the surveillance van, and the detective and myself that were working with them. To us, it was just fun because we had this van with a periscope and all these different microphones that were stationed around the outside in case we had conversations, and that was really my first contact with the Secret Service, and it had nothing to do with protection, but I realized that they were really some really good guys. They were very good at what they did, but they were just easygoing, and they were very appreciative of the help that we gave them.
Steve, do you remember when this would have been right after about 2006, I guess, right after Sandy Springs became a city, I think. But anyway, do you remember when that the cop was dragged and whoever had done it left their car at Dunwoody Country Club, and so the call went out, and as you know, I lived over there fairly close at the time, and I've never seen so many cops. They were dropping from trees, and it was every brand you can hope to imagine of when whatever it was that when the call went out that a cop had been hurt, and they had the guy, and my God, it was everything from marshals to sheriffs to.
And you were on the border with two jurisdictions there too.
Yeah,
that was right on
DeKalb and Fulton.
Yeah, I remember when I first started in this business in 1976. I worked at Emory University for about 8 months. I was trying to get my certification, my mandate done, and Emory was hiring. It was security then. Campus police weren't really police then. So you had an old DeKalb County patrol car, an old Plymouth Satellite. That's how old it was. And then you had like a Cushman, a little three-wheel Cushman that you rode around the campus. And I wasn't very hut about it. I thought it was kind of cool. I worked at night, and I said, okay, I don't know anything about this, but we had a burglary one night, and one of the sorority girls came home to the sorority lodge. There was a person inside burglarizing the place. She surprised him. He took her hostage. The call went out, and it went to the campus officer that responded. And she got on the radio, said he's holding her hostage. And then the sergeant went up there, and I was the third car. And I know I wasn't supposed to have a gun because I didn't have the security clearance, but I had the Doomsday briefcase, and I had a big State Trooper 357 in that briefcase. And I tucked it in my belt, and I went up behind the two of them, and the guy said, give us your gun. And the sergeant said, throw him your gun in, which Tony's probably cringing because that's a no-no. And then he said, do you have a gun? And the sergeant said yes, and he surrendered his gun. He says, anybody else? And he said, Steve, do you have a gun? And I go, yeah. And he goes, well, hand it to me. I went, no. And I'm backing down the stairs. The only signal I knew out of that scenario was the 63, which was an officer needs help. And so I went back down, and we had a county radio. I didn't even know what would happen, so I go, this is Unit 250. I have a signal 63. And the world went crazy at that point. DeKalb cops came from all over the place. Long story short, the girl was not hurt. The guy left. We never found him that night. He turned up in Grady County. He was a local drug addict. Sheriff knew him. They went and got him at his house. They arrested him. But I learned two things. I learned that what 63 was, that when you need help, the cars that were coming were going to come full speed, and that what little common sense I had enough common sense that night to realize if I give him my gun, I have no options. And I know I got written up by the sergeant for not doing what he told me to do, and then I think I got promoted from driving around the hospital on a little buggy to actually driving the Cushman around. So I was there for about 8 months, but I had a little bit of an education during that time.
And I'm sure, just like last night, I was giving a speech at a Veterans Association meeting, and as I looked around the room, these are all basically Vietnam veterans. There were a few sprinkling of veterans from today, but I was sitting at a table with a couple of them, and within seconds they were telling a story,
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure every cop in the world, you could sit down at a table, and Tony, you too. I'm sure that all could come up with story after story after story about things that have happened.
Tony has a few stories. We don't have time to get into them for Tony's sake.
I have good stories and bad stories. Some that I look really good, and some that I look really stupid.
Well, that's the learning process, though. But that'd be a good topic for a book, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah. Well, I'll throw this guy a plug. We had a Air Force pilot on. His name is Bruce Coey, and he's writing. He's writing a series of books actually, and he's into volume 4 now. That it's called Vietnam to Western Airlines, and it's about his coming as a pilot from Vietnam and then getting a job with Western Airlines, and then it was bought out by Delta, and he's still with them. And it's very interesting. Like he calls it, is oral history, and he goes around to different Vietnam veterans and talks to them. And what were you in Vietnam? What happened here? Or what? And it's basically only Air Force jocks that he talks to. But like by the middle of the show, I was calling him Dr. Bruce because he had not realized what he was doing, but what he was and what he is doing. And I'm sure this has got to work with police as well. But there are a lot of guys that came back obviously with PTSD. And it's all well and good to say, well, we're going to send them to a psychiatrist or psychologist or whatever and talk to them about, their PTSD and what they did in Nam. Well, he was breaking the barrier because he was there. And a vet doesn't mind talking to another vet. And he was helping so many guys, didn't even know it at the time, but to get them to talk. And I'm sure it worked the same way in the police department.
It's one of the old thin blue line. You didn't talk about stuff, and a lot of it, so with me, I mean, listen, I came in a long time ago, and there were a lot of ethically questionable things that I saw that I never talked about, and the only reason I did later on is when I went to Sandy Springs and we started that, I took a polygraph, and I realized we were going to have to talk about some of it, or I was going to have trouble passing it. And it was interesting to see how that old line of silence was a strict rule back then. But I think, and it's different now, obviously. But we're about to come to the end. First of all, I'm going to tell Tony, thank you, appreciate it, appreciate you chipping in on all this stuff, and I'll see you when I see you.
Always a pleasure,
all right.
Steve.
Okay, all right. Well, take care, everybody, and we will talk to you again on the next episode.
45 years of experience is behind the most trusted name in auto transportation. Passport Transport, the first and finest today. That's why Passport Transport is the preferred auto transport for major auto manufacturers, concours, museums, tours, and collectors, and should be your choice from across the state to across the country. When you have the need, go to PassportTransport.com and enjoy the peace of mind referenced experience will give you. Passport